Hello guys and welcome back to another video. So today what we're going to be looking at is my guide to Dragonknight tanking. It's going to be presenting the way I like to play my Dragonknight, and it's going to be covering all the aspects of the build that you need to know about in order to tank successfully. Now one thing I will say is, and some people might be thinking this, is why release this so close to patch notes, because there will be some changes to tanking, and basically what I'm going to be doing is acknowledging those changes and mentioning them and how that changes things if I believe it's relevant to the Dragonknight tank that I play myself. Now, in addition, I do have a lot of other things planned, so that's why I am releasing this before the patch, but don't worry, it'll be up to date and it's not something I'm going to have to redo in a week or so I just wanted to dissuade any concerns there. Without further ado then, let's get into the first part of the build, and that is the sets. Now I want to make it clear from the start that I'm going to give you a beginner choice and also the choice that I want you guys to try and run if you're making it up to endgame and you've farmed all the sets, because I do know sometimes that set grinds can be a little bit long. So the first set piece we're going to talk about is Ebon. And Ebon is great because it's really easy to farm. You can get it from Crypt of Hearts quite easily, and honestly with a few hours you could have a decent set, perhaps not perfect, but you know, it's better than having to grind for Alkosh, which could take a lot longer. This is why it's also a beginner set, and the reason the set is so strong is primarily because of the 5-piece. The 2, 3, and 4-piece are nice as it does make us a little bit more tanky, but the 5-piece is going to be buffing our group. And as when you tank, it's really important to try and maximize the amount of group support you can provide, as even when you're main tank, and main tank is what I have most experience with, you should be looking to try and buff the group in as many ways as possible, as often your kind of, self-survivability is kind of secondary, as long as you have a minimum, as long as you're not dying, it's kind of secondary, if that makes sense, and you should be looking to provide as much as you can. And the reason that max health for your group is nice is because in environments where AoEs are happening, where excess damage is outgoing, and it's hitting quite hard, the extra 1000 can mean the difference between a live DPS and a dead DPS, and so that's really the strength of it. It's going to mean that our runs, if we're doing group dungeons, are a bit harder. If we're doing no death runs, if we're doing hard mode trials, it means we're giving them that extra little bit of buffer, which just increases the chance that people are going to survive through various mechanics which might otherwise kill them. Now let's move on to the next set, and this is Alkosh. So 5-piece Alkosh is really strong, primarily because of the 5-piece benefit, and let's just walk to my front bar, primarily to the 5-piece benefit, because it allows us to reduce the physical and spell resistance of any enemy when we activate a synergy in an AoE area. So this means we can even hit trash packs with it, which is really strong. Now the reason this is good is because it's going to allow us to boost our group DPS, which in turn means we have faster clear times, so it's going to save you some time, but also in trials it's going to allow us to perhaps skip some mechanics, maybe skip a lunar phase in a hard mode VMAL, for example, though maybe that's a little bit far away, but even then, trying to do a speed run, for example, in a dungeon. If you don't have Alkosh, and I know some of you might not have Alkosh, especially not Alkosh rings, for example, or Alkosh weapons, I would recommend using Tavas. Now, the reason that Tavas is nice is that for a beginner it's craftable, so even if you can't craft it yourself, you can go get a crafter to quickly do it for you. And look, hey, even hit me up at some point if you want me to craft some stuff. I'm happy to help you guys out in your tanking. Basically, this is solid because it allows us to generate more ultimate, which in turn, it means more defensive ultimates, it means more group buff ultimates, and just to very briefly look at it, we have Warhorn buffing our group stats and our damage, or Magma Shell providing our group with a nice damage shield alongside making us a bit tankier. So that's just some of the benefits of Tavas. So there we go. So just to reiterate, we have Ebon, that's the beginners and the endgame choice. We have Alkosh for endgame, and we have Tavas for when we're learning how to tank, when we're just getting the sets. Now let's move on to looking at the Monster Helm choices, and I have 3 choices for you because I know that sometimes Monster Helm RNG can be really bad, but also the interesting part is that honestly, the 2-piece Monster Helm sets for tanks aren't that good, and all of them shine in different situations. So what I would say for endgame that I really like the best myself is Lord Warden. Now this is good because it provides ourselves with a nice little bit of self-tankiness, and it will allow us to hit those max cap resistances, which means we're taking the least damage possible. Now keep in mind, and this is something I just want to briefly address, you do not need max cap resist to tank things. I've tanked VMAL hard mode as a main tank with only about 24k, 25k resistances perfectly well. So the myth that you need to have, 32.5k max cap resist, it is false. But it is worth keeping in mind, if you can get to that level without sacrificing your build, then it actually is worthwhile. And Borden is one of the ways you can do that. I think I run with roughly 35k and 30k spell and physical respectively. And that's unbuffed, that's just self-buffed, without any sort of combat pro, for example. And I think with combat pro I will max out my resistances. But another great thing about this is not only does it provide ourselves with nice resists, but it can also buff our group, which means if there's AoE fights and and our group is standing within the AoE of the Lord Warden, it means they're going to getting a little bit extra tankiness, which can always help because they might not die, and it's in a similar vein to Eben. Now, one of the caveats to this is that as main tank, sometimes we'll be standing a little bit too far for the 5-meter radius to actually hit our allies, but at the very least, it's going to be hitting some of our allies. It's definitely not going to hit the whole group, but some is better than nothing in my opinion. So the next option you have is Bloodspawn. Now, Bloodspawn, the 1-piece is obviously not very good, but the 2-piece, we're able to generate more ultimate, which in turn, similar to Tava's, means more ultimate, more warhorns, more damage mitigation. Really solid choice here. Now, the 6% proc rate looks very low, especially compared to the amazing proc rate of Lord Warden, which is 50%. But don't be dissuaded by that. In most fights with a few damaging effects ongoing, the proc rate will be decent. It'll be up a decent amount of time. Though, honestly, the second part of this, the physical and spell resist buffs, I don't want to rely on that because I believe I'd much rather have a consistent, almost 100% uptime of Warden resist rather than relying on something which is far less frequent. And it's probably why I gravitate away from Bloodspawn. In addition, in a really tight rotation in Trials, honestly, the extra ultimate from Bloodspawn isn't going to make that much of a difference, and I'd rather use Lord Warden in that regard. Though keep in mind that Bloodspawn is perfectly acceptable, and honestly, in 4-man content, might even be a better choice in some situations. So let's quickly now move on to the third option that you guys have, and it's kind of what I would say, you kind of swap it in and out with Lord Warden, as it actually operates in a very similar fashion. And that is the Rakukamas set, and I probably butchered the pronunciation, so I'm sorry about that. But this set is nice in that it's going to be proccing as friendly Spider to heal our group with a 10% chance every time we heal a target. And if we're running an AoE heal, such as Vigor, that means in a 12-man raid, we're pretty much going to be proccing this off cooldown, Pop, and out comes a Sentinel. And when we do that, what we're going to get is a nice healing to our group, and also a nice stamina return to our group. And it's got a 5-meter radius, similar to Lord Warden. Now, the difference with this is it's actually going to spawn the Spider on the target healed, so we don't have the same worry about it actually not hitting all of the group. Though in some situations, if we're not stacking, it might just hit one person, so even then it's not necessarily perfect, and it's not necessarily going to be hitting the whole group. Now, because of that, this does shine best, similar to Warden, when we all are stacked together, but honestly, there's not that many fights where that's the case. At least not in a very tight stack where the main tank is also going to be able to stand on top of the group, as often main tank will be facing the boss away to not cleave the group, to not damage the group in some way. Now, one thing as well to keep in mind that the patch is kind of nerfing this a little bit. The effect the Spider provides will be interruptible, which does mean that it's going to be providing less resources over the long run, and especially in fights with AoE CC. In addition to that, you probably have already noticed if you paid attention to some of the DPS coverage of the patch notes, stamina is getting hit a little bit hard by the, well, I mean, a little bit maybe is, well, I guess it depends who you talk to, but stamina is getting hit hard by the patch, and that means stamina we're getting back is honestly less important because we're going to be seeing less stamina classes actually, less stamina DPS actually in our trials, which in turn means we're only really getting a heal, and at that point, perhaps it's better to just go with Lord Wardens. I mean, with the nerf to stamina, the only real benefit now we have is it allows our DPS to block a little bit more, and also perhaps roll dodge a little bit more, sprint if needed, and really it's not going to be benefiting us too much in terms of stamina DPS because there'll be less of those around, at least it seems to be the case. Anyways, that's the 3 choices, and if I was to give you guys a beginner versus endgame choice, I would say Bloodspawn is a beginner choice, and Warden or Sentinel would be the more advanced choices once you've farmed out all your gear and got nice traits. Now, speaking of traits, what traits do I recommend? So on our body armor pieces, I would recommend trying to get sturdy in all of them. Now, the reason behind this is, very briefly, and this does kind of get into our CP discussion, is that you have a few ways of getting block reduction. Now, we have sturdy, we have jewelry, and we have CP passives. Now, basically what I would recommend doing is choosing, do I want to do it for the CP passive line, Shadow Warding getting a reduction, or do I want to do it for armor? And I personally prefer to do it for armor, as I don't like the diminishing returns inherent in the CP tree, as I believe it kind of makes the block reduction from the CP tree a little bit less efficient than doing it this way. Now, in addition to our block reduction, I also like to use 2 shield play enchantments. Now, these are strong because there's no diminishing returns. They're added as a flat value, which means that we're getting that full block reduction, which means that we're going to be able to very efficiently reduce the amount of stamina we're using to block over, for example, sturdy, which obviously the more we run, the less efficient it is. Now, on our shields, we're going to be using reinforced. Now, the reason behind this is because of the CP tree passive. I forget the name, but basically what it does is enhances our armor value by 75% on our shields, so reinforced is a really solid option there for getting the most out of that passive. Now also keep in mind that Nirnhoned is probably slightly better, but honestly Nirnhoned is such a an expensive and or difficult to drop piece that if you got a reinforced Alcross shield, just go ahead and gold it out. And likewise, if you're going to craft your Tava's weapons, because we'll just be replacing that with Tava's, if we're just a beginner, just go ahead and craft reinforced. It's not worth spending the money. I think it's 10k gold roughly for the Nirnhoned piece, just for the trait stone. So keep that in mind. Now in terms of weapons, there's a few options. We can go defending, which is really nice for making us a little bit more tanky, but what I would recommend doing if you do get it to drop in Alkosh is infused on our front bar and probably defending on back bar. Now the reason I like defending on back bar is when we do bar swap, and I've covered this time and time again, we're going to be dropping block, so it's really nice to have defending just in case we get hit in the face, and the little bit of extra resistances might mean the difference between us getting one shot and just barely surviving. Now infused on front bar is primarily because of our Crusher enchantment. And Crusher enchantment is something I recommend running on your front bar for sure, as it debuffs the boss, which in a similar vein to Alkosh, which we've already covered, means higher group DPS. And infused is going to further increase the amount we're actually reducing the target spell resist and physical resist by, so really solid there. And honestly, the extra 2,500 resist, as I've already stated, isn't really needed. It's kind of just something that you can use, it's nice. But if you do have an infused Alkosh, please do use that if possible. And likewise, if you're crafting your Tava's weapon, make sure that your Tava's on your front bar is infused, as you will see your group benefiting from it, increasing their DPS. Now, the next thing that I run enchantment-wise is magical recovery on one of my jewelry pieces. Now, the reason I do this is I don't feel like I need to honestly be running, shield play on all my pieces. Now, one option you can do is run a shield play here, and then take off a few sturdy pieces and actually run infused on some of the bigger pieces, like our cuirass, like our legs. That is something you could try out, though I personally have just done it this way, as I do like to try and maximize my magical recovery, because that means, more uptime on igneous shields, more uptime on magica buffs, allows me to cast more magica intensive abilities, so that's why it is like that. Magic recovery is really quite nice in a tank, because honestly our magic pool isn't that big, so it's important to have a high level of magica sustain. Moving now on to the enchantments. Now what I recommend for endgame is Tri-Stat enchantments on all of our body pieces and on our shield as well. This is the way that we get a really nice stat line, and if you are wondering what stat line do I want for my tank, 30k health is really the perfect level you want, alongside really trying to get above 30k stamina. The Magicka is kind of just leave that, don't spec any points into Magicka, don't enchant anything into Magicka, just let it end up as it is. And you might be thinking, well, if I'm doing Tri-Stat, it's going to end up like this anyways, right? But this is kind of following on to the beginner's advice. So you might think, well, I can't afford Tri-Stat enchants like 20k a pop, or 16k if you get a little bit cheaper. 16k a pop, that's really expensive for all my body pieces. And so what I'd recommend doing is enchanting your armor with just a normal enchants and trying to get 30k health. And once you get 30k health ticked off, just go ahead and invest the rest into stamina and try and get that as high as possible. Now obviously your stat line won't look quite as nice as this, but it'll be perfectly usable, and honestly for months I tanked just using large normal enchants and not even worrying about Tri-Stat, as it was very expensive and I had to save up the gold. So yeah, just to reiterate, Tri-Stat if you're advanced and you have lots of money to spend, and if you're not, just use single enchants and just enchant until you get 30k health, and after that just invest everything into maximum stamina, as this helps with blocking for longer, using stamina abilities, and having higher vigor uptime, which means more group heals and less chance of our group dying. Now in terms of magic recovery and the other buffs, honestly, look, you want to be golding your weapon to try and buff for healing a little bit. You want to be having a high magic recovery. My magic recovery here is 1200. Keep in mind, if I pop a pot, we're going to be boosting that to 1356, which is really quite a nice level, and it's something I'd recommend. Also, keep in mind, I am Vampire, which boosts us even further. Vampire provides 10% extra recovery, and when we're at stage 3, is also going to reduce the damage we take at lower health. So Vampire is a really solid choice if you do want to tank, and it's honestly something I would recommend, because it just provides that extra bit of sustain, that extra bit of damage reduction. And let's just very quickly look at it, just to keep that in mind. So the passives I'm talking about in particular is Supernatural Recovery. You'll see there, the stamina is not so good because we're blocking a lot. It means it's set to 0, so keep that in mind. And in addition, we're getting this, which reduces our damage. Damage dealt to you when you fall below 50% health, which is a fairly high threshold. It's not great, but it's a benefit, which I would recommend at least keeping your Vampire at stage 3, though honestly, I'm a little bit lazy and I end up having it at 4 a lot of the time. Now there's another added benefit. Now the Morphodrain Essence is actually going to, when you activate it, restore your ultimate. So in certain fights, especially as an off tank, you can use this to get more ultimate, which in turn means more Warhorns. Now, a few other things that come to mind is, first off, let's just quickly look at the attributes. In terms of allocating this, just allocate it in a way that's going to get you the stat lines I mentioned before with a 30k health and as high stamina as you possibly can. Now, if I was at max CP, I could probably allocate it all into stamina, which might be quite nice if you want to move in between DPSing and tanking. Now, the reason that my stats aren't quite as good is because if you're not familiar, as you gain a CP points, you also gain a stats. So if you gain a green point, for example, you're going to be getting some more stamina, same with red and same with blue. Another aspect I missed was the enchantment on our back bar. Basically, in terms of back bar, there's a few choices. You can go with some stamina back or some magicka back. Those are probably the best two. And it's really just dependent on how you feel resource-wise, what you need more of. I personally like this, as I want to try and maximize the amount of magicka I have in any given point, as our magicka pool is quite low and the costs are quite expensive. Another really important but sometimes overlooked buff is if we go to Alchemy and see medicinal use, it tells us that if we get this, we're going to increase the resulting effects of our potions by 30%. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means that it's going to enhance the effectiveness of our tripods, because it's going to make the major fortitude, the major intellect, and the major endurance buffs last for 30% longer, which, if you see it works out at 47.6, means that we can have a permanent uptime on these, as the pot cooldown is 45 seconds, meaning we never have to worry about having a magicka recovery dip up and down. So before getting into the skill discussion, I want to very briefly also just cover some supportive aspects of the build, namely the pot use, the food use, and the Mundus stone we're going with. So first off, pot-wise, what I find honestly the most useful are either the Essence of Magicka, which just dropped from trash, so very cheap to use, as you'll find out, using Magicka pots translates very well into extra stamina based on the Dragonknight's passives. But if you do feel like spending a little bit of money, tripods in my experience cannot be beaten. Now, some people do like to use Essence of Lingering Health, but with the patch upcoming, these will be nerfed. So honestly, I think that Essence of Health tripods are your best way to go about actually, tanking harder content, as it gives you all the stats back, which means, well, more buffs, more uptime on abilities, more heals, basically more of everything, and also can provide a nice quick heal in dire situations where perhaps you take a burst damage and you want to heal yourself, a lot quicker than the healer might necessarily react to. Now, in terms of food, and this is to go back to what I said about, max stats and our undaunted 511, having the most max stats we possibly can, being very good for a tank. Similarly here, we're picking the food that provides the most, and so, extra magicka, health, and stamina is all really beneficial for a tank. And in terms of other options, honestly, there isn't really any, and on the bright side, buying this kind of food is pretty cheap anyways. Now, in terms of our Mundus stone, and I already talked about magicka recovery, but what I recommend, honestly, going with the Atronach. This is just to pretty much just boost our magicka recovery even further and enable us to have better sustain with using our sometimes high-cost magicka abilities. Anyways, with that dispensed with, let's get right into the skills. So our first ability is Pierce Armour. Now naturally we need to taunt enemies, otherwise people are going to be getting clobbered on the head and getting killed pretty quickly unless we maintain aggro on them. In addition, Major Fracture and Major Breach are really solid, as it allows us to do more DPS in a similar vein to Allocation and our Crusher enchantment. No reason not to use it, to be honest, and the other morph isn't that worthwhile, and if you're thinking that this interacts negatively with Elemental Drain, well, they did fix it, and on the bright side, the changes to Elemental Drain, well, who knows how it'll pan out, but perhaps it won't be as used as much as it used to be. So the next ability on our bar is Igneous Shields. Now, this is great because not only does it provide a nice self-survivability tool for giving us a damage shield, but it also allows us to shield our group, which means they're less liable to die, and is similar to Eben, giving them more effective HP. Now on top of that, it also allows us to get the Major Mending buff, which is really important for synergizing with Vigor, which we'll see in a little bit. Now one of the probably the most important parts of this ability is not only does it give the shield and the group shield, but also when we activate it, it restores 5% stamina. This is really important because when we're blocking, as you'll see right here, when we're blocking, our stamina recovery is 585, but when we block, it's going to be set to 0. As you see there, 0. So we actually do need to have alternate ways of getting it back, our stamina back, and Igneous Shields for the Earthenheart passives is just one of the ways we can do that really effectively as a tank. Now the next ability is Echoing Vigor, and this is an amazing AoE heal, and as you see here, honestly, the range is quite large, which means in a group environment, if we're tanking the boss away from the group, even if we're a little bit away, it'll still hit them fairly consistently. So that's a really nice, and it doesn't suffer from a small radius like things like Warden do, which I've already talked about. Now moving on to Vigor. Now this is an ability that in the past, when I made a video on it, had a little bit of controversy, in that many people said, look, I don't want to get into PvP, I really do not enjoy it, and it seems a little bit disheartening to know that if I want to be a great tank, or at least do the best I can, I have to use this ability. Now, unfortunately, what I will say is, if you really do want to maximize your potential, there's no real way about getting around this ability, at least on a Dragonknight, as we really don't have an access to a really efficient AoE heal on a Dragonknight. However, I will also say that keep in mind the grind is not too long. From what I've been told, it can take around about 10 hours of just consistent sort of group farming experience in PvP, and then you'll have this unlocked alongside Warhorn. However, if you don't have it yet and you're really struggling for an option, I'm going to provide you a few things to think about. So if there's not a Dragonknight in your group, you could go ahead and run Engulfing Flames, which is going to increase the amount of damage you see at the bottom that enemies take from flame attacks, so that can be useful for synergizing with various abilities which do flame damage to increase your group's DPS. Alternatively, you could go with a Morph of Inhale to Deep Breath, which interrupts enemies, which in turn can be good for some abilities, some fights, where you may have to interrupt them to stop their various mechanics, which might otherwise hurt the group significantly. Other than that, though, unfortunately, we don't really have a big heal per se. I guess you could go with Coagulating Blood, and with the patch changes, I guess it'd be Green Dragon Blood as they are changing around the buffs, so you could do that for a self-heal, but keep in mind that honestly it's nowhere near as good and is selfish and does not actually help our group, rather than just giving ourselves buffs, which, as a tank, we want to be trying to provide as much as possible, as long as, we're tanky enough not to die. We want to be trying to ensure we buff the group up. The next ability we have is Heroic Slash, and I'll always talk about this, so probably don't have to go over it in too much depth. If you do want to see it in more depth, please do check out my other videos. But basically, the short story is Minor Mim is really good because it debuffs the boss's damage incoming to you and also to your group for like AoE mechanics they might do. It'll debuff that damage to them. And also the extra bit of ultimate is nice in making sure we can have more ultimates such as Warhorn. Now, in terms of front bar, and I just want to briefly say this, these abilities are on our front bar because they're all quite short, anywhere from 5 seconds to a 12-second buff. And we want to be minimizing the amount of times we're bar swapping, and just to sort of demonstrate, every time we bar swap, our block drops, so that every time we do that, if we get hit by a powerful ability, we might get one shot. So it's really important to try and minimize and get in the habit of sort of decreasing the amount of times you have to bar swap. Now just return to another point regarding Igneous Shields and Vigor in your front bar. A nice interaction in order to try and empower at least all of the ticks bar 1 is to do this and this, and if you time it right, it's going to empower a lot of it, and this is going to be a little more efficient than having Vigor in your back bar or Igneous in your back bar, because both of them work very well together, and the major mending buff you get is only 6 seconds long. It's also worth keeping in mind that to try and maximize it, you can animation cancel your Vigor, and what you do is, instead of doing this, you just press it, then right click instantly, and as you see, it will cancel the animation, and that's just, comparison, back and forth. Moving on now to the next skill, Absorb Magic. Basically, this is nice as it does provide some extra block reduction and also allows us to block an extra 8% damage. Now, I did say before that our armor trait, our enchantments on our jewelry, and the CP trait are the only way to get block reduction. Now, what I meant by that is it's kind of like one of the only ways you really choose to kind of get it. Obviously, with this it is a choice, but I guess I probably should have mentioned it as well, though it is a skill, as naturally the block reduction you get from the one-handed shield passives are kind of just something that you already get and you don't really choose per se, as you should be using all these passives. Anyways, to get back on what I was saying, in addition to obviously the passives it provides, which is why you should be on the front bar, by the way. Actually, I see some people use this on back bar. The passives at the bottom of that ability tooltip are really important, and that's why it is on the front bar. But in addition, you can also use it to absorb health from projectiles, and this is really useful on things like Rakat, tanking him when he does his minigun phase, as just simply spamming this will allow you to heal through it and put less strain on the healers. So it's really nice. Obviously, it won't actually work with every single ability, so sometimes you will just have to go with the old Igneous plus Vigor combo to heal yourself back up. Moving on to Aggressive Warhorn. This is really solid because it provides nice buffs to our allies, extra DPS and extra survivability, in addition to also giving us a major force buff, which is quite strong. Now with the patch upcoming, this is going to nerf this Aggressive Warhorn. It's going to sort of nerf the major force component, which does mean it won't be quite as effective. But keep in mind that even if we didn't have a sort of major force component, if we just had the 10% extra stats, this ability would still be run, because no other ultimate in the game buffs our allies' stats by that long duration of 30 seconds. So don't worry too much about it. Warhorn will still be strong, and even going into the patch, it will still be the best ultimate for tanks to use if they want to support their allies. Bar swapping now. Inner Fire. In a similar vein to, Pierce Armour, we want to be able to taunt the enemies, and this one is specifically used for taunting enemies at range, if perhaps, we want to taunt something before we get in the fight, perhaps a priority target. Don't want to spend too much time on this, and the reason it's Magicka, briefly as well, is that we want to try and mix up the amount of stamina and magicka costs we have, as we don't want to overload, because then we might run out of one resource, which can be quite problematic for a tank. Now, Unrelenting Grip and our Choking Talons are our main ad management tools. Basically, we use this to drag in enemies outside of a stack, such as in ad fights, and I have made a video on this if you want to look at that. Please do check it out, it's a bit more detail. Basically, we use this to chain enemies in, which in turn allows our DPS to apply their ground dots and AoE cleave them down much more efficiently. Now, one of the nice things about this is it provides Major Expedition, which is getting buffed next patch, and by casting this, such as on the big cats in VMall, we can use it to kite them and not die, because obviously you don't only get one shot with those cats. If you've ever been in there, you know what I mean, and it can be quite embarrassing. In addition, the more for this to Unrelenting Grip also gives us back magicka, so if you do accidentally try and chain something, if you're not using tab target, this often happens, so you might chain the same target twice by accident. This is nice as it will refund the magicka, and it sort of makes up for any mistakes you might make. Now, Talons is what we do to apply minor maim to our group ads, so to multiple ads at once. It's really solid for that, as obviously doing heroic slash to each one individually can be a little bit tiresome, and also it costs a lot more stamina to do so. This is quite a cheap magicka cost comparatively to apply minor maim to many enemies at once. In addition, if they are susceptible to getting immobilized in place, it's really nice for keeping enemies in place once we drag them, as some mobs will be liable to run back out after we chain them in, so Talons is a way of ensuring that they stay in place on top of those DPS ground dots that our group has applied, and that everyone dies very quickly, so that we can speed up the amount of time it takes for us to complete various content. Now, the next ability is going to be Variable. So if you are a beginner using Tavas, Shuffle is a great and probably the best way for us to get our dodge chance, and it's on our back bars as a long buff, likewise with Hardened Armour, and it's something you'll swap every 20 seconds or so to refresh, and then go back to our front bar again. Now, if you're not using it, and you're using, for example, Allocation Ebon, which is, the end game build, then what I would say is get rid of Shuffle, especially with the upcoming patch with the nerf to Major Evasion, which makes it, I think it's 15% dodge chance, which is quite significant. I think, honestly, now that my resistances are quite high with Warden, I don't really need to be dodging attacks if I'm not using Tavas, so I'm personally gravitating towards removing it and replacing it either with Igneous Weapons, if we want to, buff our own heals up, and maybe some of our group aren't using, aren't actually getting their spell or weapon damage increases, so we can give that to the group, so it's a nice utility option. But if everyone is using their pots, and honestly, this isn't such a great ability for us purely, but if everyone is using pots, then we can also go with another option, namely in the Undaunted line, Mystic Orb, and casting this is just going to allow our group to sort of... You know what, I just did not mean to aggro those, so that's terrible. Anyways, moving on, pretending the mud crabs did not just get attacked by the Mystic Orbs. Basically, the other perks and their abilities, so Hardened Armour, really nice ability. Now you can go for Volatile Armour, which will send out sort of damage to the surrounding environment when you cast it, and this is a nice initial aggro tool, but to be honest, I do prefer the 10% max health shield, and it is getting buffed with a patch, meaning it will be even stronger. Now, it only lasts for 3.5 seconds, but honestly, by the time you cast it and swap bars, the boss should have done roughly that amount of damage anyways, so the short duration isn't that big a deal, and honestly, you should get your mileage out of it. Another honourable mention to keep in mind is also Circle of Protection. Because of the patch that's buffing this ability by doubling its duration, it suddenly becomes quite an appealing option for providing some group buffs in terms of survivability, as the stamina cost is kind of more justified at a 20-second duration or around about that, rather than the extremely expensive cost right now for only 10 seconds. In terms of where this would go, it would go on our back bar, perhaps instead of Major Evasion if we're not using that and we're using our Alchemy or our Ebon. Alternatively, we could also use it to replace Talons or Unrelenting Grip, as in some fights you won't need chains and you won't need Talons. Honestly, this is worth keeping in mind that often in some fights you can't even use these really, and if that's the case, always feel free to swap it out for something that might benefit the group more than having abilities that you don't really utilize throughout the fight. Now, the final ability to cover on our bar is Magma Shell, and the reason it's on our back bar is that we actually are not going to be using it too much, and that Warhorn is going to be, Aggressive Warhorn is going to be the one that we're using the most, as it provides the most to the group. So when do we use this? Well, primarily we use this in dire situations where suddenly our group is starting to wipe, and we realize, oh, if we don't actually go ahead and res some group members or provide our group members some extra shielding, we're not going to be able to complete this content. Now, this is probably more the case in 4-man content, where if your group wipes, you can go ahead and pop this, and then res your group back up and complete content you otherwise would have to reset. As in trials, for the most part, your group can actually get the reses if you're main tanking, and if not, your off tank will be covering it, so keep on pumping out those Warhorns. One thing I will say as a tip, if you're in a 12-man content and a lot of your group are dead, do try and wait before a fair portion of them are res before warhorning, as obviously the buff is not going to actually be applied to them if they're dead. So that's worth keeping in mind. Moving now on to the last part of the build, which is the CP tree discussion. First off, let's look at the defensive lines, so to speak. Now, in terms of this, you want to modify this dependent on the trial you're doing. So, for example, in VMAL, we have a lot of elemental damage incoming, so we want to spec into here. But in something like Sanctum Ophidia, we want to have lots of physical damage reduction. Now, in a general sort of rule of thumb, I like to recommend basically assigning these points in a way that reflects your spell and physical resist. So if you have more physical resist, assign more here, and if you have more spell resist, assign more into hardy. Now, in terms of other points, I like to put some into quick recovery, as not only does it increase the mileage of your vigor on yourself, but also allows your healers to heal you a bit more efficiently and worry less about keeping you up as their heals go a little bit more in terms of going the distance, so to speak. Now, some of the key passives just to highlight is Shield Expert, that's what I was talking about before, about increasing our armor. Spell Absorption is okay. I mean, in addition, Unchained is nice, so they are nerfing Unchained, I noticed, which means it won't be quite as strong when you get CC'd. Though on the bright side, honestly, there's not many situations where you're getting CC'd as a main tank, unless you kind of mess up and let something hit you when your block is done. Moving on to the blue tree, 100 into Blessed. Now, this is really primarily because we want to maximize our vigor healing, as it does hit the whole group, and that means this 25% is really quite a significant increase in the amount of overall healing we're doing. In terms of the other points, put them into Precise Strikes. Now, this is going to increase the amount of heals that our vigor does when it crits, as it is counted as a weapon critical. Now, the nice part about this is also we get Perfect Strike unlock, which is going to just further increase the amount of times our vigor is critting, which is always good. Not much more to say about this, as honestly all the other options are not too great. So yeah, Blessed and Precise Strikes is what I'd recommend. Moving now into these trees, I will say this tree, for me, is a little bit of just me playing around, and I haven't actually tinkered with it to maximize it. But for now, what I've found is that I've put a lot into stamina reduction, as it does alleviate the pressure onto our block, as we are using stamina to block, and it allows us to invest more points in more stamina into actually keeping vigor up at a high level, as we're just reducing the cost of this. So 80 into that, I think it works quite well for me and just allows me to use vigor a lot, allows me to pierce armor a lot of things, and also keep good heroic / uptime, alongside casting any other stamina related ability. In terms of this, I put 17 points into Magician. This is just to provide a little bit of reduction on our magic abilities, as some of them can be quite high cost. Now, this might not necessarily be the right ratio, maybe more into Magician would be more fitting, but for now it's what I have it as, and it's worked well so far, so it's what I can recommend. Now, I put 75 into Arcanist, and I do this for the simple reason that extra magic recovery, as I said before, is really solid for enabling more Magicka uptime in terms of their abilities that have Magicka costs, as naturally our Magicka pool is quite low comparatively, and the cost of these abilities are quite high, so it's good to have high regen to be able to cast them more sort of consistently. Now, just to sort of remind everybody, 0 points into Shadow Ward. Now, the reason I already covered, but just to reiterate, we've gone sturdy in our armor choices, meaning we do not want to assign any points into Shadow Ward, and instead the benefit of that is that we get to assign more points into reduction and into recovery. So that's about all for the CP trees, and honestly that's about it for the build, guys. So if you did enjoy the video, please do let me know if it helped you out. As always, if you do need some help with your tank, please don't hesitate to send me a message. On Twitter, for example, I do have my Twitter, which you can find in the description, alongside on Reddit if you find me there, or even at the YouTube description. You can let me know if you need help, but please let me know how you found the video. It'd be great to hear your feedback. And yeah, there'll be more videos quite shortly to look forward to. So until then, guys, thanks for watching, take care, and bye for now.